So let's talk about this thing, elasticity. I've mentioned this. There's a chapter on it in the book. That's where we should be at. You should be looking through that. Elasticity, it's going to feel a little intimidating to some people once we get in. There's going to be an equation. There's going to be math involved. But don't panic. So if we think big picture, what do we mean by elasticity? Now again, if we were in class, we could have a discussion and people say stretchy. Oftentimes what I end up saying is stretchy, just right, you let it sit there and it stretches. No, obviously what we're looking at is stretchy in response to a force. In other words, something that is elastic relative, again, this is going to be a compared to what question, right? A rubber band is elastic compared to, right? My eraser, my dish rag, my cleaning rag here, right? However, this here is very elastic compared to this marker. And this marker, right, even metals are somewhat elastic. So again, what we would do is put the same force on and see which one responds more. Okay, so elasticity is a general term meaning responsiveness or stretchiness, response to a force. Now, why is that relevant? Well, the force we're going to put on, at least right now, the elasticity we're going to talk about is going to be price elasticity. We're going to talk about price elasticity of supply and demand. In other words, the response to a force. And the force we're going to put on is price. Now, why the heck do we care about this? What are we even talking about? Let's just sort of throw up two notional demand schedules. We have demand schedule 1 and demand schedule 2, right? Which one is more elastic? Which one is more responsive? So here we're looking at price elasticity of demand. We can also look at price elasticity of supply. We can look at income elasticity of demand. In that case, what would be the force? The force would be a change in income. So which of these is more responsive? Again, up until now, we've sort of just said, look, we are going to talk about demand schedules. They slope down and to the right. Our law of demand tells us that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Cool. But we'd like to develop something in our toolkit to be able to talk about these specific demand schedules. Well, this one is steeper. This one is less steep, right? Yeah, okay, fine. But let's see if we can build a little bit more of a toolkit here. So, if we think about which one of these is more responsive, more elastic, why don't you all, again, as an exercise here, I'm not going to check you on it, but as an exercise, why don't you commit? Just jot down on a sheet of paper there, which one of these is more elastic. Is it demand schedule 2 or demand schedule 1? You got that? Okay. So let's, just for fun, it's going to be easier to assess them at this same point. Okay? So now the question would be, do you want to go up or do you want to go down? And we could have a discussion about that in class. There's no reason one way or the other. So we could either look at an increase. Now, so let's just we're going to put the same force on, an increase by that much in the price. And which one has a larger response? Well, demand schedule 2, the response is a reduction in quantity by that much. Demand schedule 1, the response is a reduction in quantity by that much. So which one is more elastic, is more responsive to the same force? In this instance, it's demand schedule 1. Don't worry if you got that wrong. Hopefully this makes sense. Let's look at it going the other way. Let me erase some of these lines. Again, if I had a larger board, I could do this, right, a little bit more easily. I'm just going to put the same force on, a reduction in the price by that much. Which one is more responsive? Before we said it was demand schedule 1. And now when we reduce the price, we're getting that much of a response out of demand schedule 2 and that much of a response out of demand schedule 1. Again, demand schedule 1 is more responsive, more elastic to the force that is a change in the price. The same, we need to put the same force on, by the way. So, what this is saying is demand schedule 1 elastic or not? Well, again, compared to demand schedule 2, demand schedule 1 is more elastic than demand schedule 2. Now, if we try and assess this at a point where they don't cross, we're going to need some other tools, because then we need to make sure the force is the same. It's a little bit more complicated. We'll come to that. But the key right now is to understand generally what we're talking about with elasticity. Now, let's say, so demand schedule 1 is more, elasticity of 1 is greater than the elasticity of 2. But now let's put in another demand schedule 3 here. Which one is more elastic? Well, if we think about it, same increase or decrease. Demand schedule 1, the change is to here. Demand schedule 3, the change in the quantity is all the way, is this whole amount. And so now it turns out that the elasticity, or the responsiveness, of demand schedule 3 is greater than the elasticity of demand schedule 1. So again, this is inherently a compared to what question. Demand schedule 3 is not elastic. It is relatively more elastic than demand schedule 1. Demand schedule 1 is relatively inelastic compared to demand schedule 3. However, demand schedule 1 is more elastic than demand schedule 2. Okay? So this actually gives us something in our toolkit to start talking about different goods. Also turns out we are going to talk here in a moment about elasticity along a specific demand schedule. So where is this useful and what's the point? Well, obviously part of the point here would be it allows me to ask exam questions, but I don't ever think that's a particularly valuable trait. Here would be the other thing. It allows us to start talking reasonably about different types of goods. So you could think about, what do you think the demand schedule for cigarettes or potatoes is more price elastic? Say we put $1 increase on cigarettes and $1 increase on potatoes. Which one is going to be more elastic? I'm going to argue almost certainly the response in the potato market is going to be larger than the response in the cigarette market. Now, why would that be? In other words, what determines elasticity? What determines elasticity, really, there's a number of pieces here. One of the pieces here is going to be the availability of substitutes. How easy is it to find substitutes? So we talked about the creation of a toll for driving into London as a means of increasing the cost of driving and decreasing the amount of traffic in London. Pretty reasonable thing. The opposite of what most jurisdictions do. So, do you think the demand was more or less elastic the first week compared to the second week? I would argue that demand was relatively inelastic the first week compared to the second week, and the second week compared to the third month. Why? Because the longer we have here, the easier it is to find substitutes. So time now is a factor in elasticity. Short period of time, you're going to have a relatively inelastic demand schedule. So you think about toilet paper. Demand was relatively inelastic in the short term. Now, partially that was because prices apparently didn't go up very much. I'm still a little puzzled by that. I'm trying to figure out if that's the function of regulation or if that was a function of stores trying not to lose customers and alienate people. But let's say that prices went up quite a bit. Now, in the short run, people went, "Ooh, I need toilet paper. And I can't even think of anything that would work differently." Of course, turns out now, given a little bit of time and a little bit of reflection, people figured out that there are these things called bidets. You can actually attach, they're not like the Europe. In Europe, you have this whole porcelain thing that's a separate thing, but this is just, it plugs into the water that goes into your toilet, and it's a sprayer that, like a kitchen sink sprayer that hangs on the side of your toilet, and people have went to Amazon and bought a bunch of them. They're actually, as far as I know, sold out on Amazon because people said, oh wait, given a little bit of time, I can find substitutes to toilet paper. The price of toilet paper is going up. Now in the short run, I need some toilet paper, but given a little bit of time, it's easier for me to find substitutes. So this is the same thing for pretty much anything else. Gasoline, electricity, water, everything else, you give it a little bit more time, you're going to make it easier to find substitutes. That's a big one here. And again, it's not just time. I mean, again, we could talk about certain goods there are not great substitutes for, or it's harder to find substitutes for, right? If you want to think about heroin, relatively hard to find a substitute for heroin, I suspect. Nicotine, relatively hard to find a substitute. Potatoes, relatively easier to find a substitute. And so even with the same period of time, we could actually now start to talk about different types of goods. Also turns out, maybe I'll put time out here as well, although I think that's a sub-point under availability of substitutes. Also turns out it matters how we define the market. So which is more elastic, the demand for LaCroix bottled water or cans of water, or the demand for bottled water generally? Arguably, I'm going to say the demand for LaCroix is going to be more price elastic, more responsive than the demand for bottled water generally. Why? Well, it's easier to find a substitute for LaCroix. LaCroix, saying it the American way, Le Croix, the French way, either way. Right? It's a lot easier to find a substitute for a can of LaCroix than it is to find a substitute for bottled water. Right? For LaCroix, there's Perrier, there's Deer Park, right? You're talking about water with bubbles, water without bubbles. You can even get distilled water. Now, again, if we're talking bottled water, it's going to be harder to find a substitute for that. And so we would expect the price elasticity of demand for bottled water to be less than the price elasticity for a specific brand. Same thing as I mentioned earlier for heroin. The demand for heroin is almost certainly relatively inelastic, relatively unresponsive compared to most other goods. However, if we want to think about the demand for heroin versus the demand for opiates, heroin's an opiate, it's derived from the opium plant. There's other opiates, I think OxyContin's an opiate, there's just straight opium. If we want to talk about the demand for opiates versus the demand for heroin, despite heroin seeming to be a relatively inelastic good, I'm almost certain that the demand for heroin is more elastic, more price responsive than the demand for opiates generally. All right, I even know people, if you wanted to talk about Oxy and other opiates that were prescribed, I know people who they ended up getting hooked on heroin because they were prescribed opiates, they took them, and then they discovered, hey, these things are a lot more expensive than heroin. Now that I'm addicted, I can get heroin for a lot cheaper than I can get prescription drugs once they're off prescription and once I'm no longer covered by my health insurance. So, how we define the market also matters here. Another piece here we could put down would be preferences. We can talk about whether something is a need, whether something is a luxury, right? So we threw out this word earlier. We said analytically, there's really no way to really talk about what we need because on the margin, we don't need anything. On the margin, everything is a substitute for everything else. Now, elasticity allows us to start to bring these things back in. We can revive this term need. We can also breathe life into this idea of addiction or dependency, right? So, if we think about how we would revive this idea, the word need. For us, analytically, something that is a need, we would probably put as what? low elasticity, relatively inelastic demand schedule. So when somebody says, I really need this, we can now process this. I'm not recommending that you do this. You're probably not going to make a lot of friends if you do this. But you could go to these people, oh, you need that? So what you're telling me is you have a relatively inelastic demand schedule for this thing. Yes. Now they're probably not going to say yes, because they're going to say, what the heck are you talking about? But if you're speaking to another economist, if you come to me and say, oh, you know what, I really thought I needed this, and I would probably say, oh, so you're saying you have a relatively inelastic demand schedule for this? Yes. Luxuries, on the other hand, this term luxury, again, people like to use it analytically. On the surface, you go, what does that mean? And really, luxuries, typically, what we're going to be, in our world, we're going to say, these are things for which you have a relatively elastic demand schedule, relatively price elastic demand schedule. How about addiction? Well, addiction, things that you're addicted to. Again, what does that really mean? I mean, addicts make substitutions along the margin all the time. All right, you think about somebody who's a heroin addict. They're making price goes up dramatically. They're going to start responding. Now, it may be hard to see, but you could think about somebody in this, right, in the quarantine situation, somebody who may have, now again, really, we're talking price elasticity of demand. I should clarify, by the way. Really, what we're talking about is price is a placeholder for cost there. And the reason I'm mentioning that is think about somebody who is in this situation, maybe we don't want to go all the way to heroin. Think about somebody who has a stash of marijuana, right? And they're saying, well, guess what? I think it's going to be harder for me to get this as this quarantine goes on. I may have to pay more for it. It may also just be that I have to jump through a lot more hoops, etc. Maybe I'm an addict, although, right, there's some question about it's a compared to what question. So I'm an addict, so what do I do? Well, my guess is people are starting to ration their stock, right? Same thing, right? As the price of heroin goes up, people will start to share a dose. They're going to start to respond. Even for things for which you are an addict, really what we're talking about here is goods that are relatively inelastic. Now the question is inelastic compared to what? Now, as I mentioned in class at some point, I'm an ex-smoker. And I had a relatively inelastic demand schedule for nicotine, right? I could be running low on money and I would go buy tobacco. Now, one of the things is, again, depending on how we define the market, turns out nicotine is a pretty broad market. I had a relatively inelastic demand schedule for nicotine. However, I had a relatively elastic demand schedule for cigarettes. Once, right, when I would move to a jurisdiction and go traveling, I traveled in Europe and discovered, holy craps, packs of cigarettes, some places are pretty expensive. However, packs of tobacco and rolling papers are relatively inexpensive. So it turns out that I ended up having a relatively elastic demand schedule for cigarettes despite having a relatively inelastic demand schedule for nicotine. Now, of course, this is a compared to what question. Somebody says, are you addicted to video games? I don't know. All right. Are you addicted to, right now I quit smoking, so was I an addict? Was I dependent? Again, if you'd want to talk in counseling terms, dependency tends to be the term here. But again, in absolutes, are we an addict to anything? No, you increase the cost sufficiently, people's behavior will respond. We have yet to find anything for which there is a perfectly inelastic demand schedule. That's not entirely true. There are people for whom they have a perfectly inelastic demand schedule. It's what we call lexicographic preferences. Those people are almost always mentally quarantined. I mean, they're stuck in a mental institution or they're given meds because the idea that there are no substitutes for things, right? In other words, there's no need to respond, no need to alter your behavior is just weird. It's not functional. Right? So we all understand that while we may have a relatively inelastic demand schedule for something, we don't have a perfectly inelastic demand schedule. Right? One of my students in another class is a huge fan of coffee, and she says, well, I'm addicted to coffee. Well, is that the same as somebody who is addicted to heroin? I suspect that the demand schedule for most people who are addicted to heroin is less elastic than the demand schedule that this student has for coffee. Right? Now, so what she's saying is she has a relatively inelastic demand schedule for coffee compared to her demand schedule for, I don't know, right? For salad, for sushi, for a variety of other things. So this is actually one of the cool things about elasticity is it allows us to now interpret the general terms that people use. Need, luxury, addiction. Now, I'm just making a little bit of space here. There's also down here, another piece is share of income. Now I'll get an object lesson here. See if I can. Some of you will know what this is. Iodized salt, right? How elastic is most of your demand? How price elastic is your demand schedule for salt? I'm going to argue that for most of you, the price elasticity of demand for salt is very, very inelastic. And that's not because there's great substitutes. It's not because you have a lot of time, you don't have any time to adapt. It's not because, I'm defining this broadly, salt, all salt. And it's not because, right, for most of us, we would probably put salt as either a need, or some people would say they're addicted to salt, right? It turns out that medically, one of the things that's really hard to get people to do is to reduce their sodium intake, right? So then why is our demand schedule for salt very inelastic? Well, it turns out salt, I don't know how much this is. I bought it 6 years ago when I moved to Billings. 6 years ago. How much do you think I spent? I think it was a couple bucks, maybe. And there's still like 2/3 of it in here. I haven't been particularly parsimonious in my use of it, and yet I still have a lot. Basically, salt is such a small share of my income that I have a very inelastic demand schedule. Now, eventually, if the price increased or the cost increased sufficiently, we would be at a point where it would start to become a larger share of my income. All right, it was interesting for me, my tieless collar here, but my shirts during graduate school, and before that, I would wash and iron my shirts. Now, I don't wash and iron my shirts. I have them laundered. Why? Because once I got out of graduate school, shirts, 3 to 5 shirts a week, relatively small share of my income. Very small share of my income, and as a result, my demand schedule became relatively inelastic. It became less elastic compared to when shirt laundering was a larger share of my income. Then this applies for a whole host of things, right? There's a lot of things we don't think about when it's a really small share of our income. Okay? So again, here's big picture, what determines the price elasticity of demand. This isn't what determines the income elasticity of demand or anyways, right? Elasticity is a general term, and so we can, and again, the share of income's compared to what question? I have a relatively inelastic demand schedule for salt compared to rent, right? If the price of salt doubled, I would have a very small change in the quantity I consume. On the other hand, if my rent doubled, I might well go find a different place to live, right? So again, elasticity is inherently a compared to what question. All right, that may be enough. That's probably enough for today and enough for Wednesday. I will go ahead and record the rest of these, getting more specific, because it's possible to get even more specific than this. But for the time being, that's probably, I'll look at the videos and decide and let you know what you should fully watch via email here.